Welcome, everyone. We're going to give just a couple of minutes for everyone to get filtered into the room. Hello, I'm watching the participant count ticking up steadily, so I'm just going to hold on for just another minute or two as Zoom admits everyone into our room together before we get started. I'm very excited to have you here today. Hey, I think most people have been admitted and others will continue to join us as we get started here. All right. So welcome everyone. My name is Sherry Castle and I'm one of the deputy directors at the National ECE Workforce Center. We are so excited to be here today to talk about the strengths and needs of the ECE workforce and our work at the ECE Workforce Center. As we will discuss throughout the webinar, we are highlighting a systems change approach to initiatives to support the workforce. Today, we are excited to release and provide information for using the systems change framework to create intentional change with and for the ECE workforce. Before we dive in, we'd like to let everyone see who is joining today. We have a poll for you to fill out really quickly for us, just so we can all know who is here alongside us. So we'll have that poll pop up. You can just make your selection. Okay, and Emily, whenever it looks like we have most of the votes in, you can can pop up the results, please. Excellent. Look at this wonderful cross-functional group of folks here with many different specialties and representing many different important components of teams needed for systems change. This is very exciting to see, and as we will discuss, each and every one of us has a part to play in systems change. Thank you for participating in that. All right, so we'll go to the next slide, and then I just need to let you know that our center is supported by a grant from the Administration for Children and Families. While ACF is the source of our center's funding, we don't necessarily reflect the views or opinions of ACF, including the Office of Early Childhood Development, the Office of Head Start, and the Office of Child Care. So before we get going, we have just a few quick housekeeping notes. First, if it would be helpful to you, you can turn on the closed captions by clicking More on your Zoom taskbar down at the bottom and selecting the language you would like for your captions. Second, throughout the webinar, you can submit questions for our speakers in the Q&A section. We may answer a few questions during the session today, primarily for clarifying questions, and we will collect and answer all of the questions that are received, and we will share it out in an FAQ document following the webinar. And we will, of course, be sharing a recording of the presentation with everyone who registered in the next couple of days. So now I have the privilege of introducing our speakers. Dr. Ann Douglas is the Research Co-Director here at the National ECE Workforce Center and a professor and the founder of the Early Education Leaders Institute at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, where she leads several OPRE-funded research projects focused on policies, practices, and systems that increase the capacity of ECE educators to lead change and quality improvement. Additionally, Dr. Douglas has 20 years of experience as an ECE teacher. Dr. Rena Hallam is also a research co-director here at the National ECE Workforce Center. She's a professor in the Department of Human Development and Family Sciences and the interim dean for the College of Education and Human Development at the University of Delaware. She has more than 20 years of experience leading federally funded research projects related to childcare quality, family childcare, and Head Start. Dr. Hallam has also served as a program coordinator for an early Head Start program and the director of Delaware's QRIS. Brandy Jones-Lawrence is the Director of Technical Assistance here at the National ECE Workforce Center, and she is based at 0 to 3. Prior to joining the center, Brandy served as the Associate Director for Policy at the Center for the Study of Child Care Employment, where she worked to promote effective state early care and education workforce policy and systems solutions in California. Brandy brings more than 20 years of experience as a state and national leader in prenatal to 5 and ECE workforce policy, advocacy, TA and consultation, and philanthropy. And last but definitely not least, we have Dr. Yujin Lee. She is the Director of Research at Early Education Leaders at UMass Boston. At the National ECE Workforce Center, she serves as the co-lead of the Systems Change Framework Impact Team. We're so excited to have this wonderful panel of speakers for you, and we're very excited to have you join us in this conversation today. So I'm going to hand it over to Brandy now and sit back. It's going to be a great webinar together.
Thanks, Sherry. Hi, everybody. Welcome. The National Early Care and Education Workforce Center is a joint research and technical assistance center that equips state and local leaders to drive change in early care and education workforce policy. The center uses a research to practice model that incorporates aligned practices and resources, educator voice, tiered technical assistance, research and knowledge development, and ECE policy content to provide a holistic, structured approach to support the advancement of professional level compensation, robust career pathways, and improved working conditions for early educators. So before we get into the goal and scope of today's webinar, I'd like to get a read from the group as to what maybe have prompted you to join us today. Maybe you are here because you are invested in improving conditions for the early care and education workforce and want to learn more. Or maybe you know change needs to occur, but don't know where to start. Alternatively, maybe you have already tried to make change to support the workforce, but those efforts were unsuccessful or perhaps fell short of the broader change that you had hoped for. Or finally, perhaps you just rolled out a successful compensation initiative and want to connect it to other interdependent and connected aspects of the ECE system to do more for the ECE workforce. So we have a quick poll to see how and where and what brought you here today. If you could just take a few seconds and make your selection. Okay, Emily, go ahead and show us the results. Let's see what we've got. So wow, a lot of us are looking to improve conditions for the ECE workforce and want to learn more. Well, this is the right place for you. All of the other folks, we have a little bit of a general spread across the other 3 reasons. This is also the right place for you. We hope to meet all of these goals with the time that we have together. Thanks for taking that poll. So whatever the reason for your presence today, we're happy to see so much interest in this issue. And frankly, we're just also not surprised because the issues and challenges facing the early education workforce, such as ensuring compensation equal to the value of early educators' work and standing up the infrastructure to attract, retain, and sustain a quality and effective workforce are both complex and critical to providing high quality experiences for the children and families we serve across ECE settings and programs. And at the center, we know what we do. We know what we do to address these challenges is just as important as how we do it. And it must begin with an intentional systems focused approach. So, to begin the dialogue with you about that today, we will be learning about the National Early Care and Education Workforce Center Systems Change Framework, why it's needed, what it is, and how it can help. We'll also be prompting you to reflect on how the change framework could apply to your context, goals, and needs. And then finally, we hope to explore some ways to learn more, take action, and engage with the center in your work. Anne, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thanks, Brandy. Let's start with what early educators are saying about what they need. Early educators have been calling for change for a long time, for good jobs with fair compensation, accessible career pathways, and great working conditions. And yet there is a lot more work still to do. These challenges, compensation, career pathways, and working conditions, are some of the most pressing issues facing the early care and education workforce, and they're the focus of our work here at the center. When we talk about the early care and education workforce, this is who we're funded to focus on at the Workforce Center. Educators who provide direct care for children from birth to age 5 in licensed early care and education settings, including center-based programs, family childcare, preschool, and pre-K. For our center, this does not include unregulated home-based childcare, such as family, friend, and neighbor care, although we recognize the vital importance of this part of the home-based sector. A stable, qualified workforce is necessary for several reasons: to strengthen early care and education programs, to provide families with reliable childcare, and to ensure young children receive high-quality care and education. Yet the early care and education workforce continues to be impacted by challenges that have caused instability across the childcare system. So let's look at each of these key challenges. Compensation is the first critically important challenge I'll talk about. There is so much research and data documenting this problem. For example, in 2022, early educator wages were far less than the national median wage, about $13 per hour compared to almost $23 per hour. Early educator jobs rank among the lowest paid occupations in the United States. This low pay makes it difficult for educators to afford basic living expenses, leading many to question whether a long-term career in the field is sustainable. Fair compensation matters for recruitment and retention. It can help attract people to early educator jobs and can help retain them in those jobs. Without fair pay, we can't build and grow a stable workforce who can work with young children and their families in our communities across the country. I'm going to read a quote from a nonprofit center director and educator that came from a set of interviews our team conducted. This educator said, "I'm not a believer that it's always about money, but when you're at these really low pay scales, it really is just about the money. Now, when you start looking into $25 an hour or something, then you might be able to spout it's not about the money. But until you can pay your house bills, it is about the money." Now I'll turn to career pathways. Early educators have been calling for more accessible career pathways so they can grow and advance in the field and professionally. And early educators, like other professionals, expect to be paid commensurate with their experience, credentials, and educational attainment. The quotes here are from family childcare educators, and they point to the importance of career pathways. In the first quote, a family childcare educator speaks about the value of career advancement, saying, the more knowledge, the more certifications you have, the better you're going to be with kids. The better you'll be able to do what is required of you. In the second quote, a family childcare educator talks about how important accessibility of career pathways is, saying, my opinion is that they shouldn't be requiring anyone to increase anything credentials if they're not going to make it accessible to everyone. Career pathways need to be easy to use, easy to navigate for all educators, those new to the field, those who've been in the field a long time, and for educators working across different program types, such as childcare, Head Start, family childcare, and pre-K. Research tells us that clear, accessible pathways help educators grow in their careers and stay in the field longer. The third key area the center focuses on is working conditions. Working conditions matter a lot. It's a key part of what a good job is. These are things like having sufficient staffing. Having enough staff not only allows for teacher-child ratios that support high-quality experiences for children, but it's also essential for many of the other workforce supports listed here. Having paid planning time, having breaks to use the bathroom, paid time off when you're sick, effective and supportive leadership, and safe, healthy working conditions and a positive work environment. Research shows that many early educators lack access to one or more of these. For example, one study found that nearly half of early educators reported having no breaks. Another study found that infant and toddler educators had less access to some of these features of good working conditions than other educators. Another research has shown that few early educators have weekly paid planning time, despite being responsible for things like curriculum planning, child assessment, and communication with families. In the absence of a good work environment, research has found that turnover is higher. And when turnover is high, children and families lose the stability and quality of care they need. Better working conditions make early education a more appealing, healthy, and sustainable career. A big question then is, why are we still struggling to make early educator jobs good jobs with fair compensation, robust career pathways, and good working conditions? What can we learn from change initiatives in early care and education and in other sectors that can help us to make more concrete progress and sustained progress? The answer is that we need a systems change mindset and approach if we're going to have sustainable change.
So, Anne, you've talked about the key challenges faced by the early care and education workforce, and now the need for systems change, for a systems change approach and lens. I think it could be really helpful if you could say a little bit more about what you mean when you say systems change.
Yes. There are several important things to know about systems change and why it's important for the workforce challenges that we're talking about. First, the early care and education sector is made up of many different systems that intersect but don't always align or fit together very well. When you work in a system, fixing one part in isolation from other parts often doesn't result in lasting change. So a systems change approach helps us to pay attention to, notice, and account for the different parts of the system while thinking bigger beyond just one isolated part or action. Research shows that understanding the interconnectedness between parts of a system and taking actions with that in mind allows greater and more lasting impact. These are some of the benefits of using a systems approach. It includes a focus on shifting underlying structures, mindsets, and principles. Sometimes what prevents change from happening is that there is an underlying infrastructure or a mindset or a set of beliefs that is holding the problem in place. If we don't see that and change that, we don't get good results with improvement efforts. A system lens helps us to see all those parts, especially the less visible parts, like a structure or people's mindsets and beliefs. Another benefit of a systems approach is that it's intentional about connecting and aligning the various parts of the system. And then all of this can promote more sustainable change. I've been using systems change approaches for a long time. And Brandy, I know that you also have done work in early care and education systems for many years. I'm curious what stands out to you about this approach to systems thinking. How does it help you to think differently about where we can start when we work to create improved compensation and accessible career pathways for educators?
Yes, and so here's how I see it. With limited time, resources, and capacity, we so often focus on fixing a single broken part, which is often a symptom of a lot of different foundational issues that are embedded in our systems. Or sometimes our change efforts are led and informed by a subsection of our sector that may not have the pulse on how the changes they make could impact the broader context or fail to take into account implementational realities that could stymie the success of the change. But having something as intentional and robust as a systems change framework gives us an opportunity to guide the design and development of our work with a focus on effective and sustainable change. Change that has been thoughtfully informed by the evidence of successful and sustainable change efforts, to move beyond isolated, temporary, or discrete solutions, to hold the initiative and then zoom out to be intentional about addressing the connective tissues that align our principles, infrastructure, and practices. But if I'm honest, the biggest excitement for me about the systems change framework comes out of the ECE work that's coming out of the ECE Workforce Center is the opportunity it gives us to diligently keep the ECE workforce's needs in the front and center of our systems change efforts. It's a necessary input for a successful and sustainable early care and education system. And it allows us to be accountable to the early care and education workforce across the ECE systems that we build.
That's great, Brandy. And I can share an example about the importance of shifting those underlying structures and mindsets. I'm thinking about data and having high quality information and how important data is when it comes to trying to change, to understand, and to improve something. If we don't have data infrastructure in place in a state or a community, we might not be able to know important things like how many early educators are there? How many are there across different sectors? How much are they actually paid right now? Who has benefits? Who has access to retirement plans or health insurance? These are things that we really need to know when we're trying to improve compensation. It's hard to make a concrete plan for improving compensation if we can't estimate what any given approach might cost. So high quality data helps us make that first step. Now, should we take a look at the systems change framework next?
Thanks, Brandy and Rena. Before we jump into talking about our framework for systems change, we'd love to hear from you using a quick poll. Here's our question. What is the most compelling thing to you about a systems change approach? Okay, so we can see our results. There are many things that are compelling about a systems change approach. So there are a lot of reasons that this is helpful. to us. Thank you for doing the poll. So now we're going to move into the change framework. This is the Early Care and Education Workforce Systems Change Framework. We'll be walking through each part of it, defining the terms that you see here, and talking in more depth about each part of the framework. I'm going to start with a quick orientation to how we structured the framework. The framework is structured like a logic model or a theory of action, or what some people call a driver diagram. It's a visual representation to show how a goal or an aim can be achieved. The aims on the left are what we're trying to achieve. Aims are the ultimate desired outcome. It's our destination. The primary drivers in the middle are the things that need to change or be in place to achieve the aims. They reflect the different parts of the systems that we've just been talking about. And then the secondary drivers on the right are strategies, how to strengthen those primary drivers to achieve the aim.
I like to think of the change framework as a guide for change leaders who want to take intentional, coordinated action to build a stable and qualified early care and education workforce in the context of their own states and communities. I also think that this approach takes us beyond a recipe for specific action and cautions us against lifting a strategy that worked in another state or community and trying to insert it in ours. It gives us a lens to think about what adjustments need to be made and for our own context and our own community and our own sector. So to stick with the recipe metaphor, the systems change framework gives us the ingredients for change. Linked with our technical assistance efforts, we can provide a way to find the right recipe for a sustainable change to take form in your particular state or context. And finally, it allows us to start small and make incremental moves on our way to authoring the full recipe book for building systems that address the needs of the early care and education workforce. So in a few minutes, Yujin is going to walk us through the systems change framework in great detail so you can get your arms around it. But before we get to that, Anna and Rena, can you talk just a little bit about how we developed the framework and where it came from and what informed our decisions along the way?
Sure. So this slide shows steps we took to develop the change framework. As a joint research and technical assistance center, we dug into both the research literature and examples of real life successful change initiatives to see what can we learn. We learned from systems change initiatives in the early childhood sector, as well as other sectors such as healthcare, child welfare, and education. And one of the key things we found is that there are strategies, or what we call drivers for change, that came up over and over again as facilitators of change. We saw them in early care and education and across all different sectors. These drivers or facilitators of change include things like effective leadership and governance, engaging in multi-sector partnerships, change that is community-driven, and having and using data to inform the change process. Rena, would you share a little more about how we developed the change framework?
Sure. Thanks, Anne. So as you mentioned, we pulled together lots of examples from change initiatives from various fields, healthcare, social welfare, public health, and we focused on the things that facilitated or were barriers to change. So in those different fields, what were the things that helped move it along and what were problems or struggles that we had? And we kind of categorized those facilitators and barriers into a list of drivers. So to create a distilled picture of what does it really take to drive meaningful and lasting change in a system. Through this categorization process, we identified 9 high-level, or what we're calling primary drivers of change. These are the what of system change. what needs to be in place to achieve success. These are the ingredients, as Brandy was talking about. And as Anne mentioned, these patterns were quite consistent across fields about the importance of these 9 primary drivers. There were things like data-driven decision-making, leadership and governance, and the authentic engagement of educators and stakeholders. Really important pieces to support and plan, implement, and sustain change across contexts.
Okay, so now Yujin is going to talk everyone through the framework in a little more detail and tell us about the 9 primary drivers. I just want to mention one last thing that's important. The framework is not an abstract sort of model to sit on a shelf and gaze at fondly. Instead, it's truly meant to take action, and it's really shaping all of the technical assistance and ways of working with states and communities that we are doing. I don't want to lose sight of that, because I want to encourage folks to keep that in mind as Eugene starts to describe the change framework. We will follow up later in the webinar with another conversation about how we're using the change framework to support states in our technical assistance efforts. But for now, let's learn a little bit more about the framework itself.
Okay, thanks, Brandy. So let me start with the framework's 3 aims. So as you see here, the first aim is competitive and fair compensation. So this means that early educators' compensation is comparable to K-12 educators with similar roles and qualifications and experiences. And it also means that all early educators are paid at least a living wage. The second aim is clear and accessible career pathways. This aim is about making sure early educators clearly see what they need, like qualifications or experiences to grow in their careers. It also means that the career pathway has multiple entry points. So educators with different education or experience levels can get started and move forward, no matter where they are in their journey. The third aim is positive work environments. This means that educators are working in conditions that are physically and emotionally safe, healthy, and supportive. These aims are designed to respond to the real needs of early educators, the needs we talked about earlier today. One thing I want to note here is that these aims are meant to apply to educators across all settings that include centers and family childcare, preschool, pre-K. It's also important to remember that all those 3 aims are deeply interdependent. So maybe even if a change effort focuses on just one aim, it often needs to address the others too in order to be truly effective. That's because progress in one area, like compensation, often depends on the changes in things like career pathways. Now let's move on to the primary drivers. Primary drivers are levers for change. They are the things that need to be in place to help you make real progress toward each aim. In the change framework, there are 9 primary drivers, and they apply to all those 3 aims. That's because they are meant to address the core parts of a system. And when we review the change initiatives out there, those primary drivers are the same no matter which aim was being addressed. Now you might be thinking that, wait, you just said there are 9 primary drivers, but I only see here 3 circles. Let me explain why. That's because in this change framework, we group those 9 drivers into 3 types. So you are seeing here are the 3 types of drivers, not the individual ones. So in our change framework, we have 3 practice drivers and 4 infrastructure drivers and 2 principles drivers. I'll begin with the practice drivers. Okay, so here in this practice driver circle, we have 3 primary drivers. These are the programmatic and policy actions that you can put into place to help make progress toward the aims we talked about. Maybe they are the things that educators and programs experience in their day-to-day work. And that's why they are often the most visible and tangible parts of a change effort. Now let's take a look at what those 3 practice drivers are. So the first practice driver is policy-specific promising practices. Having this driver in place means that you are using the programs, strategies, or tools that are effective and tailored to your community's needs. And these promising practices are specific to each aim. So the strategies that work for improving compensation may look different from what you need to improve working conditions or career pathways. Second practice driver is targeted and aligned policies. This one is about making sure that your state local policies are actually set up to support your goals, especially the promising practices you're trying to put in place. So for example, your goal is to increasing wages, and this policy, targeted and aligned policy, this driver is about removing those policy barriers and making sure that things like funding formulas or licensing requirements are actually working in favor of your goals, not getting in the way. Third practice driver is data-driven decision-making. Anytime you're implementing a strategy or program, this driver helps you stay focused and informed. So it means that you are using the data throughout the process to understand what's working, what's not, and what might need to shift to make sure your change efforts are successful. So now let's move on to the second type. So the second type of driver is infrastructure drivers. These drivers are meant to address the structural parts of a system, things that support, connect, and hold everything together. So even if you have a great programs or strategies just ready to go, they can end up being less effective if the infrastructure isn't there to support them. And there are 4 drivers in this category. First infrastructure driver is leadership and governance. This driver is about having strong leadership and coordinated governance structures in place to guide the work. Second driver is multi-sector and multi-partner collaboration. As we all know, workforce issues don't sit in just one part of the system, and no single agency or sector can solve the problem alone. That's what this driver is all about. So it's about bringing together the right partners, each with their own expertise, to tackle different parts of a system in a coordinated way. The third driver is data infrastructure. This one is about having the data system in place to make it possible to actually use data. Earlier, I talked about data-informed decision-making as a practice driver, and here's a difference. Data-informed decision-making is what you do with the data, and data infrastructure is what makes that possible in the first place. Without the right infrastructure behind it, using data can be really limited. You might not have access to the information you need, or it might not be available when you need it. Last infrastructure driver is sustainability. This driver is about having reliable funding and supportive policies in place so the work can continue, not just in the short term. When this driver is really strong, change efforts can keep going, even when leadership changes or priorities shift. This sustainability driver is what helps actions and initiatives stick around long enough to make a lasting impact. These 4 drivers might not always be the most visible, but they are really essential part for making sure that change is possible, effective, and sustainable. Now let's take a look at the final type of the driver, principal drivers. These are about the beliefs, mindsets, and values that influence how people approach change efforts and decide what matters the most. 2 of the 9 primary drivers fall into this category. Like infrastructure drivers, they are not always front and center. You may not see them right away, but they're still really powerful. In fact, principal drivers are often influence how all other drivers are put into place. They help guide what gets prioritized and shape the values behind how decisions are made. So let's take a look at the 2 principal drivers. The first driver is engaging early educators in systems change. Having this driver in place means then bringing early educators to the decision-making table as an equal partner. They help define the vision, design the strategies, and guide the work. This isn't just about asking for their feedback or input. It is about shared leadership, where educators have real influence on the decisions that affect their day-to-day work. The second and final driver is culture and narrative shift. This driver is often not easy to use, but it's also one of the most powerful drivers. When used really well, it can lead to a major shift in public perceptions. We've seen this on other fields. When the narrative shift, policy change followed. So having this driver in place can help shift how early educators are seen and also valued, and open the door for stronger public support and real investment in the workforce. Okay, so now that we have walked through all 3 types of primary drivers, I want to take a moment to show how these types of drivers actually work together. Let's say a state is working toward the aim of improving compensation. They might create a salary scale. That's one of the practice drivers, especially policy-specific promising practices. And they bring early educators into the process to co-design the scale. This reflects the principal driver, engaging educators in systems change. Then they also use data systems to track implementation as well as the outcomes. That's an infrastructure driver, specifically data infrastructure. This example shows how all 3 types of drivers play a role and how they are interdependent. They each support different parts of a system, and they work best when they used together. So to address complex workforce issues, we really need to think across all the 3 types of drivers, not just one. Now I will turn it over to Rena to explain more details about the final component of the change framework, which is secondary drivers.
Thanks, Yujin. But let me first take a moment to recap what we've explained so far about the change framework. So we put the slide up again so you can see all of the pieces together. So first, on the left side, we've defined and talked about our aims. And we have 3 aims that reflect the 3 priorities here at the center. And I know many of us on this webinar. And they are competitive and fair compensation for the ECE workforce, clear and accessible career pathways, and positive working conditions. So the change framework is all about ensuring that early educator jobs are good jobs. And then we just heard about the 9 primary drivers in the change framework. Yujin just went through all of those. These are the what, those important levers for change that we have found again and again in the research and practice evidence about successful change initiatives. We need to have the primary drivers in place to support and achieve our aims. So before we go into the secondary drivers, and you've heard about the primary drivers, let's stop for a minute and take a poll. Let's think about, or I'd like you to think about, compensation initiatives for ECE educators in your state or community. Knowing that the primary drivers are the what if systems change, which of the primary drivers do you most want to support, to leverage, or strengthen in your context? So in your poll, we've listed the 9 drivers, and if you just want to select one that you're most interested in strengthening. Oh, wow, look at that. So pretty even actually across, which is super interesting to me. It seems like multi-sector, multi-partner collaboration and sustainability came out as particularly high, but all seem to be of interest to this group. So that's really interesting to see. And so when you're thinking about this, as you're reflecting on those primary drivers, it's like, and you're thinking about which ones would I really like to strengthen in my community, the next question is the how. How do you do that? And that leads us to the secondary drivers, right? So the secondary drivers are practices and strategies that we need to put in place to support the primary driver. So how do we strengthen the primary drivers? We use these secondary drivers, and I'm going to go over some of those. Each primary driver has a set of secondary drivers. These are promising, innovative, evidence-based strategies that we can use to put drivers in place, and they're unique and specific to each aim. So for example, to strengthen the data infrastructure for compensation may not be the same thing as strengthening the data infrastructure for accessible career pathways. So there are many different secondary drivers, and they are unique to compensation, career pathways, and working conditions. So I'm going to show some examples of secondary drivers, but you can find all of them included in the new brief that we're releasing today. But the examples that I'm going to go through and share on this webinar are all relating to our first aim, which is fair and competitive compensation. So to talk you through this, so here we are looking at the primary driver of policy-specific promising practices. These are concrete practices focused on improving compensation, and it's one of our primary drivers in the category that Yujin just went over around practice drivers. So when you look at that piece, we have 3 secondary drivers in that space, and they're listed here. So first is having a wage scale designed to ensure competitive compensation with K-3 educators based on factors such as roles, qualifications, and experience. The second secondary driver here is a benefit model designed to ensure parity also with K-3 educators that includes health insurance, retirement plans, loan forgiveness, and tax credits. And then the final secondary driver in the area of policy-specific promising practices is early educators have access to financial relief such as child care assistance, hiring and retention bonuses, and tax credits. And you'll notice here that we have a parenthesis that says an interim strategy. And what we mean by that is the financial relief, such as these things that we've listed, are really, really important, but they do not replace these other 2, having a wage scale and a benefit model. So there are, of course, many ways to try out or implement these strategies. And as we said, the change framework is not a one-size-fits-all instruction manual. It's a guide that identifies those 9 important drivers that need to be in place to achieve the aim, and then offer a set of secondary drivers that research and practice have shown can help strengthen and solidify those primary drivers. So Brandy, do you have an example of one of these secondary drivers?
I do. So we're currently working with the state to support the development of a comprehensive wage scale that aligns with the career ladder. There are many steps and ways to develop and implement a wage scale and decisions to make along the way. For example, in setting the compensation bands, what is the floor? Is it a living wage? Is it MIT? You have to make those kinds of decisions, and you have to use the data and the principles that you have for your system to make those kinds of decisions. And then how are we defining comparability to public school educators in the context of a wage scale? Again, another set of decisions that have to be made and informed by a wide variety of folks using the data that's available. And what are the roles and competencies that need to be reflected in each bracket? And how do you recognize and account for compensation? I mean, for compensating experience. So to support decision-making processes for all of the agency leaders, educators, higher education leaders, and program and policy leaders that are part of the change team, we've all come together to offer insights, perspectives, not only about where to start and what to build from, but also what about the implications for implementation that may arise when we move to a model that's at scale. So using the change framework for the state's multidisciplinary team has been really useful and informed each decision along the way, all the while taking care to be mindful that there's systems change drivers that they have identified that they most want to address within the work of putting into place the practice, which is the way to scale that aligns with the career pathway.
Thanks, Brandy. That helps. That really brings to life that secondary driver and how it could be used in a change planning process in a state. So now I'm going to go over a second example. So in this secondary example, still staying with the same aim, which is competitive and fair compensation, we're looking at the infrastructure drivers. And remember that Yujin reminded us that sometimes we don't see those, as they may not be as visible to us. And here under infrastructure, we're looking at data infrastructure. So data infrastructure is when data systems and processes are in place to support decision making. So within data infrastructure, we have 2 secondary drivers, or the how, to support data infrastructure. And these are the following. Compensation related data exists in formats that allow researchers, policymakers, stakeholders to extract meaningful insights, and this information is accessible to key stakeholders. So that means we have that information that we need to make good decisions to inform our plan. And then the second secondary driver is compensation related data are collected from center-based programs, family child care educators, and out of school settings. And so this ensures that we have a system to collect this information in an ongoing way, because one of the key parts of sustainability is not only launching a compensation initiative, but tracking it over time to make sure that we're seeing the impacts that we want to see from it. So when designing a compensation initiative, it's critical to know actual compensation data from all of their sectors. So this is the third example. So again, we're staying with the compensation aim, and this time at the drivers where we categorize as principles. So principle drivers are about the underlying beliefs, mindsets, and values that shape the change efforts. And one of the principle drivers is engaging educators in systems change. And so we have outlined here 3 secondary drivers that strengthen this driver of engaging educators in systems change. The first is making sure that educators who represent a range of backgrounds and experiences are active leaders in designing and implementing the vision and plan for change related to the compensation aim. So what does that mean? Not just educators from one sector, making sure that we're really inclusive and pull from all the different sectors of early care and education, and including those educators in early stages. The second secondary driver is that outreach strategies, capacity building efforts, and information, so essentially all of the things that we do related to the compensation initiative, are appropriate, available, and accessible to ensure that educators can effectively engage in the process. So making sure that information is available to them, making sure meetings are held in ways that are appropriate for them to participate. And then finally, and very importantly, the third secondary driver here is that educators have substantial influence and decision-making power in shaping and guiding compensation initiatives. So they're working with policymakers and administrators in making these plans and not just giving feedback at the end. So one of the things that we have found in studying change initiatives is that over and over again, when the people affected by a policy, for example, a new wage scale, are not included in its development, lots of mistakes can happen. Important information can be missing. Maybe designers didn't understand the implementation context, or maybe some types of educators just got left out. And ultimately, the change didn't work, it didn't last, or it didn't include everyone. So with these principal drivers, the change framework tries to make these things visible to help change leaders early in the process to think through each of these. Okay, so we've presented a high-level view of the change framework. We've described the 3 aims that we focus on, as well as the primary and secondary drivers that are needed to achieve these aims. So this slide highlights a few important insights about using the change framework, because I know it's a lot of things. So it's important to know that not all non-primary drivers are meant to be improved all at once. It does give you a big view, but it's not the expectation that you work on all primary drivers at the same time. However, it does seem that sustainable systems change requires attention to those 3 types. So we talked about infrastructure, practices, and principles, that attending to those 3 is a really important piece of designing and implementing sustainable change. And finally, we know that effective change happens in phases or steps. So what that means is that you can start with 1 or 2 drivers. So as we were in the poll trying to get you to think about 1 or 2 drivers and build along the way, because it's a process. With systems change is a process. So now I'm going to turn it over to Brandy to talk more about how to use the change framework.
Thanks, Rena. So earlier I highlighted the point that the change framework is meant to be used to help guide change initiatives. It is a tool for state and local leaders to use to identify how and where to take action to improve workforce systems and supports through the practice or policy change they desire. In other words, our goal is that the change framework will be used by leaders as an assessment and reflection tool as they look at their system and seek change. For example, for each of the secondary drivers, we can ask ourselves the question, to what extent is this secondary driver in place in my context? Not at all, some, a little bit, or a lot. By doing this, you can identify strengths and things that you already have in place while also identifying areas where improvement is needed. You can reflect on which areas might be the most effective changes you can make and areas where you have the most momentum right now. One really important point about using the change framework for assessing and reflecting on your system is that no one person or subsection of the early care and education system can answer this question for every secondary driver because no single individual or agency has that knowledge or informed perspective on their own. Remember, this is about systems change, and systems are complex, interconnected, and have dependent parts. So to assess the status of a secondary driver, it requires multiple perspectives. It needs to involve a group or a team of people who bring different perspectives from more than one state office or agency, from childcare and Head Start programs, family childcare, higher education, unions, researchers who study the ECE systems, and advocacy and professional associations. So now we have available for your exploration and discovery the release of a companion document to our webinar. And it's called the Introduction to the Early Care and Education Workforce Systems Change Framework, which is now available on our website. The link we're putting in the chat will take you to the new brief. And you are among the first to see this document, and we couldn't be more thrilled that so many of you will have the webinar as a primer and the accompanying intro document for a deeper dive. In your deeper dive, you'll be able to look and find in the intro document the definition of the National Early Care and Education Workforce Center's aims. It also discusses a systems change approach and the change framework in detail. It elaborates on the primary and secondary drivers, all of them, not just the examples we gave you today, and it provides examples for how the change framework can be used to guide efforts to make change. When you have a moment to review the brief, you can see all the primary drivers and secondary drivers as they relate to all three aims for a fuller picture of what we touched on today. As you review it, we urge you to keep that reflection prompt in your mind, to think about your own system. What's already in place? What could be a priority area for improvement? Now, I'd like to briefly pivot to share some of the supports and resources that we offer here at the center that can support the use of the change framework to achieve progress on compensation, career pathways, and good jobs for early educators. As I mentioned before, the National Early Care and Education Workforce Center's research to practice model supports local and state leaders in implementing early care and education systems change to improve career pathways, work environments, and compensation systems. To do that, we use teams of researchers, technical assistance specialists, and communications experts to bring content expertise, consultation, tools, and thought partnership to states and communities through a continuum of services and offerings that go from universal to targeted to more intensive supports. Through this tiered approach, we aim to be nimble and responsive to the needs of the field and ensure that strategies, resources, and tools promoted by our center are based on the latest evidence and draw on the expertise of our embedded team, our strategic partners, and early care and education policy leaders, and of course, educators themselves. Across the continuum of support, the through line we strive for is that the resources we provide are actionable. In our universal efforts, we develop resources and tools intended to bolster the capacity and leadership of early care and education workforce change makers in all states and localities. The idea is to offer everything from generalized resources like this webinar to off-the-shelf tools, templates, planning, approaches for supporting early care and education workforce actions at the state and community level. We also offer the field evidence-informed practice briefs or research to practice briefs, which are short descriptions of innovative and actionable practices on topics we know the field is grappling with. And based on our ongoing scan of field practices, we're able to produce these briefs for public consumption. In our targeted efforts, we offer a variety of engagements from coffee chats, which are kind of low barrier, more informal opportunities for state and local leaders to hop on a call and engage in real-time conversations about the ideas and strategies discussed in our research to practice briefs and different drivers or parts of the change framework. But more in the targeted category, we also offer more intensive cohort-based communities for action that provide a facilitated process for state and community teams to take action towards their career pathway, compensation aims, and workforce conditions in a rich space that provides support from subject matter expertise and peers as they design and implement an action plan. And last, but definitely not least, the center offers intensive supports to cohorts of states and or community change teams through what we call Action Research Partnerships, or ARPs. Action Research Partnerships engage cohorts of state and community level change teams who are ready to work on specific practice and infrastructure changes that will improve early care and education career ladders, compensation scales, and workplace policies. Action research partnerships are long-term, maybe as many as 12 months, and are designed to increase a change team's capacity to lead using the systems change framework approach, coupled with integrated learning opportunities that borrow from continuous improvement and human-centered design science. Through this approach, the center hopes to offer the right size support at the right time to bolster system improvements for the early care and education workforce in states and communities across the country. I want to say that we hope that you have found this discussion of systems change to be informative and motivating. As you think about using this approach in your work and context, we are here to support you. Before we share some of the center's coming attractions and get go to a few questions we've received, I'd like and to give us our best customer service satisfaction, I want to use the opportunity for one last poll to help us understand how we can best support you. It's a two-parter. So now that you've heard about our approach to systems change, the first part is, which aim do you most want to support to help? Which aims do you most want support to help you in your work for improving the early care and education workforce's experiences? You know, it's a tough choice. We need all of these things. All right, Emily, where did we land? Okay. Again, a decent spread, but obviously, I think to most of us, it goes back to those comments made by our educators, those quotes. It does come down to the compensation that our educators deserve. But not far behind are those accessible career pathways, and it's certainly those good working conditions. All right, now for part 2 of our poll. As you think about that aim and working towards it, what types of support do you think you're ready and are the right size for you to engage in with the Workforce Center? And as you can see, it's multiple choice. So, all right, let's see where we landed. Okay, another nice spread. So this tells me that we're offering that continuum I spoke about, and that there's folks who have interest in all aspects of the types of offerings we offer. So this is really good to see. Thank you so much. All right, let's see where we are. All right, thank you for your responses. So now for our next coming attraction. We'd love to invite you to join us on May 13th for a discussion that builds on today's presentation and the introduction to the Systems Change Framework document that we just released today. It's going to be a coffee chat that will be, again, a low barrier opportunity to hop on a call with other folks in the sector to really grapple with and talk in more depth about how to use the change framework and where and how they see it benefiting the work that they have underway or are planning to do. And if you want or need more, we've got you covered, because we have several more planned coming in the next month, as well as the launch of our next Action Research Partnership. So the next Action Research Partnership and Community for Action will both be focused on career pathways. So please stay tuned for the recruitment information we'll release just prior to launching those activities. So in order to do that, you need to keep updated about the center's offerings. So please ensure that you are on our email listserv. You can use the QR code on this slide or visit our website at any time to join us. You can also send us an email at the addresses on the next slide. Sherry, why don't you take us home?
All right, thank you. Thank you so much to our speakers for a great presentation and a great conversation today. I've been watching the questions coming in, and there is a lot of energy around the systems change approach and improvements for the workforce overall. We are going to have the speakers answer some questions here in a few minutes. And I want to take this chance to remind you about that Q&A feature if you had maybe forgotten to put a question in there. So if anything is lingering in your mind or has come up for you, go ahead and click that More button down on the Zoom taskbar, and then you can access the Q&A feature right there. So please take a moment to go ahead and add any questions that you have there. So we really appreciate all of the thoughtful questions that have come in. And like I mentioned, we're going to take a little bit to answer some of them now, but there will be some that we aren't able to get to. And so for those, we will compile them, we'll answer them, and then we will send out an FAQ document to all of you who attended and those who also registered and couldn't join live today via email. So keep your eyes out for that if we don't quite get to your question today. You will also receive a follow-up survey as soon as we finish up here today, and then again in the follow-up email. And in the spirit of research to practice, as you've heard about, which is the very core of our center, we take your questions and feedback very seriously, and we do use every bit of that information to help us continue our work, to improve our work, and to improve our supports for the field. So please, we really appreciate you taking some time to provide us your thoughts. So you can visit our website, nationalecceworkforcecenter.org, to learn more about some of the services and supports that Brandy was just mentioning. You'll be able to access all of our briefs there and learn more about our center. You can reach us via email, as they're on your screen, workforcecenter@childtrends.org. And we are always so happy to hear from you. So please don't hesitate to reach out. So now with the remaining minutes, we're going to go ahead and address a few questions. So let's get to that. All right. So the first question I have is, how is the Workforce Center looking to address increasing compensation for the ECE workforce in private childcare settings? Rena, I wonder if you would mind jumping in on that one.
Sure, I'll take that one. So first, increasing compensation, having high compensation is one of our 3 aims, and we've talked about that across the webinar. It's a central focus of our work. Brandy talked about the resources and supports offered through the center to support state goals, but I think it's really important to think about the change framework and how it can be applied to ensure that private community-based childcare settings are included. So if you think about that educator engagement piece and some of those primary drivers, using the change framework helps you to identify who are the key partners and who are the key educators that need to be involved, and it helps us to ensure that we don't that we include all those sectors and then we don't miss anyone if you think. So it helps us kind of think through that change process to ensure that we include private childcare settings in any type of compensation work that we do.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, the next question that I have here is for people who have maybe listened in to what we've talked about today and are excited and energized, but think, oh, we are just not in the right space. We have too much already going on. We're not ready to take on this kind of big scale systems change. What can they walk away with today? Let's help them not just feel sort of overwhelmed and deflated. What can they take as maybe the right next step or a small step in the right direction? Brandy, let me toss that one to you.
Sure. It's totally okay. Systems change is a very complicated and sort of monumental task, right? And you think about a house, if you're remodeling the bathroom, it can't get it done in one day. And so I think what I would want people who are feeling a little bit overwhelmed and wondering how ready they are to take this on is to start small, incremental changes. Even if you begin with one driver, you're doing something differently than you've done before by just managing the symptom. And so I think you should think about right sizing your expectations, right sizing where you think you are and where you have the most momentum, and starting there. This framework is designed for you to be strategic at a large level, but also in a very incremental way if you need it to be that way. So I think that there's an opportunity to utilize this resource wherever you may find yourself on the continuum of readiness, on the continuum of large scale change or incremental change. It just takes one sort of that first step and perhaps that first driver.
That's a really important reminder, Brandy. Thanks so much for bringing it home. I do think sometimes we see these frameworks and talk about the complexities of systems and feel like we have to do the perfect approach, but reminding ourselves that we can start with small efforts that really do add up over time is so important. So thank you for that. Yujin, I have a question for you that's actually kind of linked to the question that Brandy just asked, but is maybe looking at a step up, right? If people say, okay, I have some of these initiatives on my plate, right? We have a mandate or we have some work to do in the area of one of these aims, and I want to start thinking about how I can use the systems change approach in our workforce initiatives in our state or our community. And they're just kind of wondering like, all right, well, what would be the next step? You know, I'm ready to take maybe a bigger step. What might that step look like? So what would you offer to them as a guidance on like a next step that they could take?
Yeah, that's actually a really great question. And that's something we've been also thinking about too. Because we want the change framework really actionable and guiding the state and community's action. So one thing we'll be sharing soon is a change framework user guide. So it's designed as a practical tool to help you reflect on where your systems are in relation to the primary drivers as well as the secondary drivers. So it will help you think through which drivers are already strong in your system and which are ready to build on and which ones could be strengthened to better support your goals. And also, as Brandy mentioned, the center offers tiered support, so you can consider joining the coffee chat or participating in the Communities for Action, or even think about the Action Research Partnership. So I would say that's kind of a next kind of action steps that you could consider, and also will support that.
Yes, that's great. Thank you, Yujin, for reminding us of the other upcoming supports and taking the opportunity to highlight that again. We have things that will be quickly rolling out. So if you are excited and ready to jump in, please do keep your eyes out for our newsletter. The coffee chat the first one is live, and we would love to see you hop in there and register and join us in those conversations so that you can where our goal is really that each coffee chat you can walk away with an action that you're ready to start taking in your own work. So we hope to see you there. Okay, so I have a couple more questions. We still have a little bit of time. So up next, this is a really interesting one and so important. We started at the top of the webinar talking about the importance of acknowledging what ECE educators want and really starting from that foundational piece of information of what the workforce wants and needs. And so as we think about making improvements in systems for the workforce, we might wonder, how can ECE educators get involved in those efforts to improve workforce systems? And I know you've done a lot of work in this area. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this question.
Sure, thanks, Sherry. So Rena talked during the presentation when she was talking about the secondary drivers and about the principals drivers. She talked about one of them, which is engaging educators in systems change. So educator involvement and educator leadership is a core part of this change framework. A common way that we think about educator involvement often comes from kind of a top-down approach to involving educators, which is important. And state and community leaders should definitely be intentional to engage educators meaningfully from the beginning and throughout change initiatives. We also want to highlight that educators can and do organize themselves, so more kind of from the bottom up, to bring their views and their unique expertise together and get involved in creating change within early childhood programs and systems and policies. Early educators are experts on how well early childhood systems actually work. As Yujin talked about earlier, this isn't just about asking for feedback, it's also about shared leadership, where educators have real influence on the decisions that affect their day-to-day work.
Thank you, Anne. I really appreciate that thinking of educators don't have to wait to be asked to be involved. And at the same time, all of, everyone who sits at a table of decision making or planning of policies can and should you be thinking about ways to bring that educator involvement, so we can all be doing our part to make sure that these policies are designed to support educators and actually meet their needs. Thank you for that. Okay, I think we have one more question, and this one has some commonalities to the first question that Rena answered about how we're looking to increase compensation for the workforce in private childcare settings. But I think the way that this one is framed really speaks to the lived experience, right, of someone who's out there day to day trying to keep their childcare program open and functioning and wants to be able to pay their educators well. And this is an opportunity to kind of talk about how the systems change framework can come to life and be implemented in real problems of practice. So this question says, in a private early childhood center setting that only has one or two revenue sources, where do the additional funding sources come from to be able to provide pay parity with public school wages and benefits? Parents currently can't afford the tuition rates, which is, of course, not, they're already high where parents can't afford them, but don't provide educator pay that's sufficient. And that is why ECE pay in private settings is so low. That's what the question asker wrote. So, Brandy, I think that you do a great job of helping us see the application of the systems change framework to questions like this, and would love to let you take this question for us.
Yes, and thank you to the participant who shared that really sort of concrete example. I guess what I would say is this is the precise reason why you have to take a systems change approach. Program level leaders and educators should not be having to make those decisions, find those resources, figure out how they're going to be able to make living wages available and compensation, professional compensation, and a reality for their workforce, regardless of the number of staff that they have. That's why it's a systems level problem that needs a systems level solution. And that's why we have to look at things like have very specific aims around compensation, to have wage scales that are informed by cost modeling, that provide the type of reimbursement in those funding streams that account for that level of compensation to be achieved for any program and any program size in any setting. We have to continue to beat the drum of using systems level changes to address system level problems. And it is not uh, a program level burden it should not be a program level burden. It should be a burden taken on by the system and addressed. And when you can use something like the change framework, and all three of those categories really have to come into play. You have to have the infrastructure in place. You have to have the data in place to understand what the cost drivers are, to make sure that that provider can pay her staff the living wage, the professional wage that they deserve. Then you have to be able to make those changes upstream. And so I would say to you that what we hope is that system level leaders are starting to recognize that these these symptomatic problems that we see on the program level really do trickle up and that have to have the attention that they deserve on a system with a systems level lens.
Thank you, Brandy. I hope that was really helpful. I hope all that the questions and answers were helpful to start to bring the systems change framework to life. We know that it is a lot of different pieces to try to hold in your mind. We hope you'll review the brief and then, like we mentioned, come to the coffee chat and join us for further conversations and additional engagements that we have moving forward. So I just want to take a moment to thank you all again for attending today. We really appreciate so many people coming out and joining us. And it's so, I think, energizing to see whenever we come together and see all of the people working together to support the workforce, and those of you who are among the workforce who have joined us as well. I'd like to thank our presenters today, Anne, Yujin, Brandy, and Rena. It was so great to hear from you all. And I'd like to also thank the many people on our team here at the Workforce Center who helped make today's webinar possible. It's truly a team effort. So before you exit the Zoom room, please take a chance to complete the survey. There's a link in the chat. We would love to get your feedback. Like I mentioned, we really take it seriously and are thinking hard about how we can continue to refine how we communicate and message all of these important concepts and make them actionable for you. So thanks again for joining us. We really appreciate it, and we hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.